Thank you for joining us this evening for the concluding elements of our Islam, Peace and Justice Conference here at STM. My name is Gertrude Rompré. I serve as the Director of Mission and Ministry here at the college, but also as the co-director of the Irene and Doug Schmeiser Center for Faith, Reason, Peace and Justice. And we are really pleased to be able to partner with the Islamic Association of Saskatchewan, with the Saskatoon Peace Coalition, and with the Department of Religion and Culture here at STM to present this conference. So welcome to those of you here in the college, and also welcome to those of you watching us on the YouTube live stream. It's been quite delightful to realize that this is truly a global experience, and we've had participants from all over the planet connect to this conference and to this really rich dialogue. So welcome to you all. As we gather here today, as is now our tradition, we acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. Tonight we'll be hearing about the topic of decolonizing the law of violence and the violence of law. And it strikes me that that topic and that theme is very much attuned to the work that we have committed ourselves to as inhabitants of this land. And so we commit ourselves to building just and right relationships among the peoples and with Mother Earth, our common home. And so we offer this conference, which is meant to build understanding among peoples as a contribution to the work of building these right and just relationships. So, as I said earlier, this conference has brought together scholars from all over the world and really engendered a very vibrant dialogue. We've seen representations from a multitude of disciplines, and we discussed the intersections of Islamic traditions, peace building, and social justice. As you have likely already heard, the goal of this conference is to challenge worn-out stereotypes about Muslims, stereotypes that all too often equate Islam with violent extremism. So in the place of these stereotypes, the participants and the presenters at this conference have illustrated and will continue to illustrate this evening how faith-inspired principles can and do foster cultures of peace and justice. So it is my true pleasure to now introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Ms. Azeezah Kanji is a legal academic and writer. She received her Juris Doctor from University of Toronto's Faculty of Law and a Master's of Law specializing in Islamic law from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Azeezah's work focuses on issues relating to racism, law, and social justice. Her writing has appeared in the Al Jazeera English, Haaretz, Toronto Star, Truth Out, National Post, Ottawa Citizen, Open Democracy, Roar Magazine, iPolitics, Policy Options, Rabble, and various other academic anthologies and journals. She also serves as the Director of Programming at the Noor Cultural Center. Tonight she will speak on the topic of Make Jihad, Not War, Decolonizing the Law of Violence and the Violence of Law, and may I invite you to the podium. Welcome.
Thank you, Gertrude, and salam, greetings of peace and justice, everyone. First, my profound thanks to Chris, Fahrizal, Gertrude, James, Brett, and Meekan for all of your efforts, what some might call your jihad, over these last few years in making it so that we could come together for these last couple of days. I am so profoundly honored to be with you here on Métis and Cree land, with all of you who are here, both in physical space and in virtual space with us. and particularly here with Professor Asma Afsaruddin, whose work has been such an inspiration and an education to so many of us. Yesterday was the International Day of Peace, the auspicious occasion for which we are all gathered here today. But this day of peace is surrounded by temporal markers and commemorations of violence. September 16th to 18th marked the 40th anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila massacres of thousands of Palestinian refugees. A few days from now, on September 30th, we will mark here in this land that currently calls itself Canada, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, to remember the colonial ravages wrought by those genocidal institutions that call themselves residential schools, in reality, torture, indoctrination, forced labor, and death camps. And while we are remembering these residential schools, we also know that the colonial ravages continue with, for instance, the current depredations on the lands of the Secwepemc, the Wet'suwet'en, and other indigenous nations across this land. And so the truth, the difficult truth, the devastating truth, is that no matter when we held this conference, it would have been in proximity to some occasion or commemoration or another of an incident of settler colonial violence, because, as Indigenous scholars and activists remind us, settler colonialism is not a historic event located at some point in the past, but rather it is an ongoing, continuous process that requires a continuous infusion of violence to sustain itself and its foundational dispossession and domination of Indigenous nations. One recent highly visibly spectacle when these multiple vectors of violence sustaining the colonial present coincided was at Standing Rock, where Indigenous land and water defenders protecting their unceded lands and their water sources were brutally repressed by private military contractors born in the ravages of the quote-unquote war on terror, founded by a veteran of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, who had also at some point led a military unit that was originally founded to effect the genocide of Indigenous nations in the United States. According to a recent report submitted to the UN by the Water Protectors Legal Collective, quote, analysis revealed that 1,671 applicants to these private military contractor deployed at Standing Rock. Out of all of these applicants, 1,671 of them mentioned a police department on their resume. 20 individuals had served at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. 2,448 of their resumes mentioned special forces. 3,669 mentioned Iraq. 2,712 mentioned Afghanistan, including US soldiers and those of other coalition and NATO member states like the UK and Canada. So is it any surprise then when it was revealed that these private military contractors sent to brutalize Indigenous land and water defenders were found to have been referring to them in their private chats as mujahideen, a word that for those of us who know Arabic simply literally means those who engage in struggle for the good, jihad, but which in the context of the so-called war on terror has come to be effectively conflated as a synonym for quote-unquote terrorism. This is emblematic and symptomatic of a pervasively anti-Muslim Islamophobic context within which Muslims effectively serve as the standard point of reference for illegitimate violence, such that even supposed progressives use jihad as a term to refer to inherently illegitimate actions or violence. For example, they'll refer to Trump's jihad on immigration or on the environment, even while using crusade as something with a positive connotation, for example, a crusade for human rights. The confluence of war on terror military contractors at Standing Rock reminds us that Indigenous people and Muslim people, our fates under colonial modernity have long been intertwined. They've been intertwined since 1492, when Christopher Columbus launched his to-be genocidal project to pseudo-discover the so-called New World in order, according to some reports, to amass resources to effect a new crusade for Jerusalem, setting sail from the very same port where Jews were being expelled from their ancestral homes in formerly Muslim and now conquered Spain. Been intertwined since European jurists drew on papal edicts enabling the enslavement and dispossession of Muslims and Jews during the Crusades as a foundation for the doctrine of discovery, which in turn inaugurated new practices of total violence and genocide, subsequently spread to other colonial situations across the world. Intertwined since 16th century, Spanish jurists debated the humanity of Indigenous peoples, whether or not Indigenous peoples counted as human, recorded in Eurocentric histories of law as the first debate on the human rights of the colonized. Since these Spanish jurists debated the humanity of Indigenous peoples by determining whether they were like Muslims and therefore to be massacred, the conservative position, or unlike Muslims and therefore simply to be converted. Yet the right to dominate across both sides of this debate was taken for granted. Intertwined since tactics of dismantling peoplehood applied during the Spanish Inquisition, tactics such as burning books and demonizing the target population's sexualities, were then exported across the Atlantic to the New World, knowing that the way to dismantle a people is to dismantle the bonds of learning and love that connect them. And our fates as Indigenous people and Muslim people continue to be intertwined. When, for example, soldiers trained in genocide on the frontier Indian wars were subsequently sent to effect the United States occupation of Philippines and massacres of Filipino Muslims, generating myths that were subsequently raised again in the context of the war on terror. For example, Trump claiming that the way to send Muslims to hell was to shoot them with bullets coated in pig's blood. When the Bush administration sought to accord a facade of legal legitimacy to the war on terror by explicitly citing legal precedents in military commissions and in legal memos, explicitly citing precedents from these same genocidal Indian wars, for example, from the First Seminole War, when Indigenous peoples were massacred for refusing to surrender enslaved Black people who had fled slavery and they were keeping under their protection, among them many Muslim enslaved. When, in turn, these practices of the war on terror executed in theaters of violence across the world, referred to in military parlance as Indian country, were then imported back within the borders of the so-called United States to Indigenous nations under colonization, including at Standing Rock. And, God forbid, our fates will continue to be intertwined in the future, as, for example, the Canadian government is currently planning to purchase its first armed drone, that paradigmatic instrument of contemporary colonial violence. And in its letter of interest to potential suppliers of its drone, outlining the scenarios for which it envisions using it, it mentions surveillance of colonized Arctic lands, colonized lands of the indigenous Inuit and people of the north, as well as targeted assassination strikes against quote-unquote fighting-aged males in Afghanistan, who, according to the Canadian government, the criteria qualifying them for death is that they are seen holding a cell phone and with some shovels behind them. This scenario of killing casually laid out in a government procurement document is what we would call in other contexts, if committed by other actors, including by those same Afghan men on the other side of this drone, is what we would call terrorism. To refer to these exercises of violence as war is somewhat misleading and somewhat of a misnomer, because as violent, as devastating a word as war is, it is still a euphemism for what it is that we are confronting. Theoretically, at least, war entails a symmetrical and reciprocal application of violence. Both sides are permitted to use violence and are vulnerable to violence in return. In international legal terminology, this is referred to as the equality of belligerents and combatants' privilege. The idea that legitimate combatants in a war are not criminally prosecuted for executing violence, for murder or assault, as private citizens would be, because it is done in the context of this legally regulated space of war. Here, instead, however, what we have is powerful states claiming the prerogative to use almost unlimited violence, while those on the other side of their tanks and bullets and drones are denied the right to use any violence or even non-violence in return. And so people under colonization are called terrorists for their slogans or for having human rights organizations. Indigenous peoples are labeled belligerents, as at Standing Rock, for simply being on their land. We're not even allowed to die without being accused of waging asymmetric conflict, as the Pentagon described those men, indefinite detainees at Guantanamo Bay, when they committed suicide, described by the Pentagon as a form of asymmetric warfare. In this sense, even the very title of my own talk, Make Jihad Not War, is somewhat misleading, because it perpetuates this idea that what is being conducted is in fact a war. But the truth is that, tellingly, there is no actual term for this form of violence. The legal categories that are normally used to describe violence, war versus police, don't apply. They break down in this context where certain aspects of war power and police power are combined to maximize the powers of violence while minimizing the responsibility of those who execute them. Other terms that are officially used to describe these types of exercises, such as counterinsurgency or pacification, are little more than propagandistic, perpetuating the idea that these exercises of ostensible violence are actually exercises of peace, necessary to subjugate and discipline the inherent violence of the colonized. A more accurate term would be the production of unilateral vulnerability to mass violence, what many progressive activists and scholars are fighting to be recognized as state terrorism or state crime. The Nazi jurist and legal philosopher Carl Schmitt, whose work has experienced a revival of popularity in the context of the War on Terror, referred to this type of violence as chillingly, quote unquote, a form of social pest control, in which the opponent is not simply an enemy combatant to be defeated, but rather a vermin or a parasite to be exterminated. A framing chillingly, disturbingly reflected in the naming of the US's computer program for calculating collateral damage as bug splat. In addition, and on top of and accompanying the physical erasure of people under this form of colonial imperial violence, and on top of the linguistic erasure of the terms to describe this violence, is the historical erasure of these exercises from the slate of memory. These exercises of militarism and imperialism, if recorded in history books at all, are perpetually referred to simply as small wars, thereby managing to minimize, as political theorist Mark Neocleus reminds us, thereby managing to minimize what in fact has been the most common exercise of militarism in the modern period, responsible for the death and torture of millions and the ravaging of entire nations and continents. It is symptomatic, for example, that the century before World War I is still referred to in British historiographies of war as the 100 years of peace, even though during that time there was not a single month when British troops were not deployed in colonial situations somewhere around the world. And in fact, today we were just in the Prairie Ink bookstore looking at books, and there is a new one out by Gwyn Dyer called A Short History of War, and the word colonialism does not even appear in the index. By perpetually erasing these forms of violence, the violence of imperial powers appears as a perpetual aberration, an exception necessitated supposedly by the inherent violence and barbarism of the colonized other, rather than being symptomatic of the barbarism of itself. Rather than being symptomatic of the barbarism of itself. For example, European authors managed to pin the blame for their foundational violences, from the Crusades to the Inquisition to the genocide in the Americas, not on their own dynamics, internal dynamics, but rather on their supposed internalization of the principles of Islam extermination. Likewise, arguments for the supposed necessity of using weapons labeled barbarous when used against Christian opponents, arguments for suspending these prohibitions on using barbarous weapons against Christian opponents when used against Muslims because of the inherent barbarism of Muslims, were then transplanted and applied to indigenous peoples in the New World of the Americas. The allegation that indigenous peoples, Muslim people, are supposedly inherently incapable of adhering to the laws of war was used to justify a complete suspension of the laws of war and exercises of militarism against them. The imprecation that indigenous people and Muslim people don't know how to respect the principle of discrimination and violence, that they participate in supposedly indiscriminate violence, was used to rationalize indiscriminate violence against them. And so, for example, we read in a 1927 article published in the American Journal of International Law, authored by one Eldridge Colby, who is a U.S. Army captain, an article entitled "How to Fight Savage Tribes," justifying the devastating French colonial firebombing of Damascus by referring to his own experiences in fighting the so-called savage tribes of indigenous peoples in the U.S. We see the application of this logic in justifying the indiscriminate violence, whether in Syria or in the frontiers of the United States. He quotes, for example, the testimony of Brigadier General John Coffey and his Tennessee troops when conquering the Creek Indians in Mississippi Territory, saying, quote, Both men and women struggled to the last without asking quarter, and, quote, not one would desert the field, but men, women, and children perished together. Grotesquely, perversely, this admission and description of genocidal violence, men, women, and children were all made to perish together. This description of genocidal violence is not cited to condemn it, but rather to rationalize and justify more genocidal violence, atrocity compounding atrocity. The idea that because they don't discriminate, they don't separate women and children from combatants, that the colonial powers are entitled to kill and exterminate them altogether. This logic of blaming the subjects of violence for the violence with which they are targeted continues to this day with, for example, the US military attributing the blame for the collateral damage of its drone strikes, when they acknowledge it at all, to the fact, or they blame it on Muslim so-called terrorists leaving women and children in the way of the US's bombs. However, Indigenous people, Muslim people, other colonized people were not simply excluded from the law, but rather strategically included in ways only to further increase and augment their domination and punishment. For instance, legal scholar Sidney Herring points out that the Indian Wars were only enfolded in the aegis of law after most of the violence had been conducted in 1891 with the Indian Depredations Act, which, rather than protecting Indigenous peoples, on the contrary, allowed settlers to claim damages for the depredations that Indigenous people committed against their property, which was, in fact, stolen Indigenous land. Under this act, U.S. courts awarded $24 million and then dollars against Indigenous nations already impoverished by dispossession and genocide. This logic of effectively forcing the victims of colonization and imperialism to pay reparations to their colonizers and imperializers continues again to this day, with, for example, Canadian courts having ordered Indigenous nations to pay the legal costs of oil corporations who the Indigenous nations attempted to sue for pipelines incursions on their territories, millions of dollars in costs. And who also, for instance, can forget the fact that Afghanistan, impoverished by years and years of devastating occupation, has now had $3.5 billion of its foreign reserves frozen and set aside to pay damages for 9/11. People under colonization are not simply excluded from law, but rather included in ways to further reinforce their domination and punishment. Meanwhile, in contrast, the violence of powerful sovereign states continues to be immunized from legal liability by the doctrine of sovereign immunity, the aegis under which sovereign acts of state, torture, war, genocide, continue to be protected from legal liability. Incidentally, this is one of the barriers to suing the Vatican for genocide at residential schools and in other practices of the colonial project, because the Vatican has sovereign immunity, even though it has the exact same status at the UN permanent observer state as Palestine. But while the Vatican is accorded sovereign immunity, Palestine is not. These violences protected under the doctrine of sovereign immunity, torture, genocide, war, testify to the violence embedded in the very concept of state sovereignty itself. And so, as scholars such as Ivan Kalmar remind us, when looking at these representations of Indigenous and Muslim barbarism and despotism, these are not simply representations or even caricatures of the indigenous or Muslim other. Rather, they must be understood as projections of European and Western anxieties about the violences embedded in their own state structure itself. After all, we must remember the state in Western political theory is defined not by its capacity for virtue or to produce human flourishing, but rather by its capacity for violence. The common definition of a state is that it exerts a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, a monopoly consolidated in part through the international codification of the laws of war, laws which help legitimize the high-tech, supposedly precise carnage of powerful states, privilege this form of violence while condemning the low-tech, imprecise violence of the dispossessed and the poorly resourced. A body of law which, despite calling itself international humanitarian law, projecting humanitarian pretensions, in fact has been used in its requirement that civilian casualties be proportionate and necessary, has instead been turned by powerful states into a license to effect collateral damage, with the US military, for instance, deeming any event that causes less than 30 civilian casualties to be presumptively proportionate and necessary. Massacre 29 civilians at a time. Meanwhile, ecocide, mass destruction of the environment, is not criminalized as an independent crime under international law at all, except under very limited circumstances. An omission vociferously, vigorously objected to by newly liberated, formerly colonized states from the 1970s onward, since they were first permitted to participate in conferences on the drafting of the laws of war, because they, more than anyone, knew intimately the connection between genocide, the destruction of a people, and ecocide, the destruction of the ecologies that sustain them. A through line that continues to this day with the, as we see, the devastation being wrought by the not-so-natural disasters from Puerto Rico to Pakistan. At these conventions on drafting and revising the international laws of war, as Amilcar Cabral, the great African revolutionary, intellectual, anti-colonial leader and diplomat, said, "We cannot coexist if we are not at first permitted to exist." We heard yesterday so beautifully from Professor Afsaruddin about coexistence. And we must remember, too, that we cannot coexist if we are not first permitted to exist. These mass assaults on existence of humans, of non-humans, are not incidental or accidental to the international legal order. Rather, they are intrinsic to its structure of legalized violence. However, as the resistance of formerly colonized states to the exclusion of ecocide reminds us, there is nothing natural or normal or inevitable about this particular way of organizing and legalizing violence, and there is nothing inherently impossible or unthinkable about a world organized in another way. Everything that is constructed, after all, can be deconstructed and built again. And so we can ask, turning to our traditions relegated to the undersides of colonial modernity, can we draw on them to revive other ways of thinking about how we might organize our relationships with each other and with the world? We heard yesterday in Professor Afsaruddin's lecture, for example, about the very strict restrictions on environmental damage that were placed in the Islamic legal framework for conducting war. Some jurists even said that to wrongfully kill even a single bird in war is something for which someone will be held to account. The eminent legal scholar Wael Halak, meanwhile, points out that the Islamic political theory of the state provides a fundamental contestation to the way that the state is sometimes imagined in some Western political theory. For example, the political theorist Paul Kahn has argued that the modern state comes into being not when it protects me from violence, but when it can conscript me into its army, when it can command me to kill and be killed for the state. In contrast to this, while Halak points out that the Islamic political and legal order never arrogated for itself the right to conscript others into its violence, and that, in fact, other duties such as the obligations to pay one's debts or the obligations to one parent overrode, in the eyes of legal scholars, the duty or the obligation to participate in war. Professor Halak's fellow eminent legal scholar, Professor Khalid al-Fadl, argues that looking at the legal regulation of rebellion and violence in the Islamic legal tradition reveals that jurists resisted granting a monopoly on the use of force by the state in ways that are almost unthinkable now in our modern context. For example, jurists de facto recognized the legitimacy of rebellion against an unjust ruler and acknowledged that the violence executed by the state can also be inherently illegitimate in ways that we are currently struggling to recognize as, for example, state terrorism or state crime. Indeed, throughout Islamic history, in millions of acts, large and small, of courage, of justice and peace, Muslims have continued to challenge structures of socially and legally legitimated violence, showing time and time again the fallacy and the lie in Oriental colonial ideologies stating that Muslims are inherently predisposed to accept despotism and authoritarianism. Time and time again, Muslims have shown with their acts of courage and resistance to violence the lie in this Orientalist colonial trope. From the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, himself, who, as historian Juan Cole argues in a recent biography of the Prophet, actually provided an exemplar of peace in a context pervaded by imperial war. To the Muslim Africans enslaved in the Americas who died resisting their enslavement, carrying verses of the Quran on their bodies. To the Muslims all around the world today who, in collaboration with other communities, continue to draw on tactics of creative nonviolence to challenge and transform regimes of occupation, oppression, and authoritarianism, whether in Palestine or Kashmir or Sudan or on the streets of Canada and the US, including by what the Prophet, upon him be peace, said was one of the most exalted forms of jihad, by speaking a word of truth to a powerful tyrant. This discussion of jihad brings us back to where we started, with the land and water protectors at Standing Rock, who those private military contractors thought that they were tarring and impugning when they called them mujahideen, those who participate in struggle for the good. For in truth, what could be not only more noble and more beautiful, but even more so, more necessary than struggle? In our current situation, when the prospect of military and environmental catastrophe and apocalypse is not some hypothetical far-off horizon, but rather the reality that colonized communities have been living with for decades and even centuries. The word jihad, struggle, shares the same root as the word ijtihad, meaning the task of exerting oneself in interpreting and reinterpreting the tradition for the current context. The problem we face right now isn't that we don't have the facts about the violence we are confronting. We have report after report on the catastrophe of climate devastation, report after report on the atrocities of militarism. The problem isn't a paucity of facts, but rather the entrenchment of frameworks and narratives incapable of confronting the violences at hand. And so, inshallah, may we continue to engage in ijtihad, to remember and revive and reinterpret our traditions, to excavate the resources necessary for reimagining and building a future transformed towards justice, love, and peace, inshallah. Thank you, assalamu alaikum, and I look forward to engaging with you in the questions.
So hi everyone, I'm Chris Sharenko. I'm co-director with Gertrude of the Center. I just mentioned my name because if you're watching online, you can send me via email to my phone a question and I will ask it on your behalf. If you're here in person, there's a microphone right there. I don't know if James, are you gonna do the same thing? Yeah. James will even bring you the microphone to ask a question, and it'd be really helpful for us if you could ask the question into the microphone so for the people that are listening on the live stream can hear and be part of the conversation. And Azeezah has agreed to take her own questions and obviously can handle it, right? So over.
Inshallah, as we always say.
Yeah. So back over to Azeezah.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so thank you very much for your talk. I'm really interested in the idea, the constructivist idea that you mentioned. And often people assume that faith-inspired actors, people working from religious perspectives, are not really agents, that they can't see that constructivist point. Can you expand a little bit about the constructivist point and how it accords with faith-inspired actors trying to bring about the changes that you so beautifully articulated for us?
When you say not really agents, you mean almost like we're represented as automatons simply acting on the basis of pre-informed religious instruction, like robots. And this is a trope that's particularly and racistly applied against Muslims, where we're almost represented as machine-like soldiers of Islam. But the truth, I think, is that this pastiche, this caricature of Muslim lack of autonomy disguises the fact, again, it's a projection, it disguises the fact that all of us are situated in social and political contexts that allow us to see and imagine some things and preclude us from seeing and imagining other things. For example, when international humanitarian law as it exists right now is treated as the ultimate horizon for deeming what is legitimate violence and illegitimate violence, it makes it unthinkable to imagine that ecocide, mass environmental destruction, could ever be considered a violation on a par with devastation against humans, even though we know from a biological perspective, even from findings generated within colonial modernity's own scientific paradigms testifying to the interrelatedness of all things, how even we think of ourselves as individual humans, but we also are simply communities of symbiotic bacteria that have got together. So we ourselves are ecosystems, and everything is connected and dependent on each other in this way. And yet, despite this, the law doesn't reflect that. It refuses to recognize ecocide as a crime. And under this current worldview, ideology, the furthest that can be imagined, there's a proposal for a crime of ecocide that's been proposed recently. The most radical thing it can imagine is to only prohibit ecological violence that is wanton, defined as completely disproportionate to the social and economic benefits that are anticipated. So, I mean, you can call Muslims automatons and as limited in our worldview, but we're situated in a context which doesn't allow us to imagine and to critique the very source of our ecological destruction, which is precisely that which is rationalized as being socially and economically necessary for human flourishing in a very narrow sense. And this is why I think it's so important that we draw on Islamic legal traditions and orders, indigenous legal traditions and orders, African legal traditions and orders, all of these systems for organizing social and ecological relations that have been relegated to simply the realm of, if acknowledged at all, as sort of peculiar culture. Oh, you know, they have certain costumes and songs and dances, but it doesn't really tell us anything serious about how we organize our legal and political orders. But it's hard to see the limitations of one particular order when you're fully situated within it. And so unless we can draw on all of these other traditions, which have and continue to be almost completely marginalized and invisibilized, it's extremely difficult to see the limitations of the current system that we're in and to imagine things beyond it. And so I sort of flipped your question around a bit, because I think, you know, rather than seeing Muslims and other religious people as automatons, maybe looking at and taking seriously these discourses is what will really allow us to be free.
Hi, can you hear me? Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you, Azeezah. Just to kind of build on that a little bit and to reflecting on the panel 3 that we had earlier this morning. We had a presenter talking about Indigenous Muslim relations in Ontario, and you alluded to some of that allyship just now in your response to Chris's question. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about more on some practical examples of this allyship in action, and how we can, of course, coming to conferences is part of the one of these ways of creating dialogue and awareness on these issues and topics, and awareness on these the interconnectedness of our current situation. So with all of that being said, is there something you can comment on or some examples you can provide us about some on-the-ground grassroots allyship between Muslims and Indigenous people in Canada, or any of the other marginalized groups that you mentioned?
Thank you for that, and thank you for your work and Chris's work in creating this forum where we can have these conversations and come together. I think Muslim Indigenous solidarity is at its very nascent stages, and we haven't seen its true potential yet in ushering in truly radical ways of thinking about social justice. Radical in the sense, not in the way that it's normally demonized as inherently violent, but radical in the sense of really getting to the roots of the problem that we face. Because if we were to take Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous nationhood, claims for decolonization in furtherance of Indigenous liberation, if we were to take those seriously in all of our social justice struggles, including struggles against Islamophobia, we couldn't take it for granted, for example, that the Canadian state is the only entity that we need to be engaging with and appealing to. We wouldn't be so ready to accept the expansion of state counterterrorism powers in the name of addressing white supremacist attacks, including against Muslims, knowing that the first people on the front lines of the application of counterterrorism powers since the founding and since before the founding of Canada has been Indigenous peoples, and that in the war on terror too, all of these powers built up, justified as supposedly necessary for addressing the Muslim threat, have been wielded against Indigenous land and water defenders, including the Haudenosaunee at 1492 Landback Lane, who were explicitly labeled terrorists by a police association. So I think that building Indigenous Muslim solidarity is absolutely vital for not just forming strategic alliances on issues of mutual interest, but in completely reshaping the terrain on which our struggles are conceptualized in the first place. We have seen really beautiful solidarity in struggles against certain settler colonial regimes. I'm really grateful, for example, for the solidarity that I've experienced from Indigenous peoples in talking about Palestine, in talking about Kashmir, and the connections, the transnational connections between Canada, Israel, Palestine, and Kashmir as projects of settler colonial violence that aid each other, that engage in weapons trades, that share in ideological and legal tactics of colonial rule. And so I hope that we can continue to build those relations so that all of our social justice struggles continue to center the imperative of decolonization and solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty and rights.
So thank you, Azeezah, for that really eloquent and illuminating presentation from which I feel like I've learned a lot. But I want to build on the previous questions. So it was also something that was coming to mind. And this reflects the conversation that we had over lunch. And you said that there are strong parallels between the Islamic legal tradition and the legal tradition of certain Indigenous peoples. I wonder if you could elaborate on some of that. Where might those similarities lie? How can they be invoked in order to conceptualize this different way of looking at the world order and help to fashion that new world order that would be more just and egalitarian and participatory? I think that's where the problem lies, is that right? So I'm just wondering if you could point to an example or two, not to put you on the spot or anything, but when you were talking about drawing on these parallels between the two legal traditions, and that's not something that most of us are aware of. Can you help us to think along those lines and kind of illuminate for us, where those parallelisms are and how they could indeed become a force for reimagining our relationships with one another? That would be so useful, I think.
Thank you for that important question, Professor Afsaruddin. I don't want to speak for Indigenous legal traditions, but I'm so grateful for the knowledge and teachings that I've had the benefit of receiving from Indigenous scholars who've been so generous to share them. And through these conversations, I've been so struck time and time again about the similarities in the way that, for example, Anishinaabe legal traditions and Muslim traditions conceptualize relations with non-human aspects of creation. We know in the Quran, for example, that non-human animals are described as constituting nations or communities like you in Anishinaabe, as well as in other indigenous traditions. Non-humans are included in relations like you, and are also, from what I understand from Anishinaabe legal scholars, for example, included as subjects of international relations, so other nations that we are in relationship with. And when we think of non-human relations in this way, it completely shifts the terrain on which we engage and completely opens up new possibilities for thinking about legal regimes, for ordering our relations with non-humans in just and equitable and liberatory ways. Right now, it's a struggle to even have one individual non-human, whether it's a river or an elephant or a chimpanzee, recognized as a person as opposed to property. in Western law. And the way that the person is imagined is still so limiting. For example, we have post-humanist scholars arguing that actually some non-human animals should be considered persons because according to the Lockean model of personhood and property, the same model that was used to justify dispossession of indigenous nations on these lands, according to this Lockean model of person and property, some animals actually are capable of owning property, and therefore we should consider them persons. Can we think seriously for a second about the profound limitations of a framework within which one is either an owner or is owned? Those shouldn't be what we are restricted to, and I think once we begin looking outside the parameters of that particular tradition and understand that for so many of us, we come from traditions that have imagined things in a very different way, that has often been erased and taken from us as well, so that we often end up reproducing and perpetuating interpretations of our traditions that were developed in the first place by colonizers in order to subjugate and dispossess us, and yet now we become ventriloquists for as if that is the authentic interpretation of our traditions. For example, when it comes to gender, we know reordering our gender relations as Muslims, as Indigenous people, reordering our gender relations was fundamental to the colonial project, but now often that extremely regressive view of gender relations is taken as interpreting the authentic version of our traditions. It's hard to say, to outline or to survey holistically the parallels between Muslim and Indigenous thought simply because this is a conversation that we often haven't been allowed to have. We're often made for our relations with each other to be mediated through the state or through Western political theory instead of talking directly to each other. And it's important, I think, too, to appreciate that it's not only the parallels or the similarities that are illuminating and important, but also the differences. Because again, returning to that verse from the Quran, which you cited in your talk, and which actually is the basis for the mission and vision for the center I work for, Noor Cultural Center, Quranic verse 49:13, which says that we have made you in nations and tribes so that you might come to know one another, and Allah alone is all-knowing and all-wise. It's not only our capacity to recognize something as the same to us that grounds our ethical relation to them. This is true when it comes to other humans. It's true when it comes to non-humans as well. So often, the ability to accept that maybe non-humans might be owed rights is contingent on our ability to recognize them as being similar to ourselves. Oh, do chimpanzees have, intellect? And do they have culture? Do whales communicate emotionally with each other? If so, if we can recognize you as adequately similar to us, maybe we can accord you some place in our hierarchy of rights. But if not, sorry, you're out. We need to be able to appreciate drawing on aspects of our tradition, like 49:13, that our ethical obligation to one another shouldn't be contingent on similarity, but rather it is precisely the differences that are valuable. And I think that verse alludes to the fact by juxtaposing this creation of humans and nations and tribes with the reminder that Allah is all-knowing and all-wise, that all of us, human, non-human, we only have access to one little part of the story, to what our senses allow us to perceive, to what our ideologies and our traditions and our worldviews and our experiences allow us to grasp. And so it's the combination of all of us across all of our differences that allows us to approach anything closer to knowledge and to a vision of justice, remembering always that any of our views on justice, on peace, on right, are contingent, as Islamic legal scholars, classical Islamic legal scholars, would always end their fatwas, non-binding legal opinions, with the reminder that, and God is all-knowing, and Allah knows, and Allah alone knows. We as humans, any knowledge we have is contingent. Allah alone is all-knowing and all-wise, and our differences are a reminder of that, and so instead of something to be sublimated, are something that we should dwell in and consider seriously.
Wonderful. Thank you, Azeezah, for that
impassioned speak, powerful words, and many intersectional topics were touched on, and I can't wait for the panel that's coming after this. My name is Brett Christoph. I'm a graduate student here at STM, and I'm part of the team at the Irene and Doug Schmeiser Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice. And we've been working really hard in partnership with the Islamic Association of Saskatchewan, the Saskatoon Peace Coalition, and the Department here of Religion and Culture at STM to host all of you, and we're beyond delighted that you guys took time out of your busy schedules in person and online, of course, to attend tonight. As I mentioned in my question, these types of conferences are one of the stepping stones for creating dialogue and expanding our ways of knowing. And we certainly have been part of that process here tonight. As a non-Catholic, actually, in my undergrad, I was always struck at the welcomeness of STM, and as part of our mandate as a college to encourage interfaith dialogue. And so even though I'm not a part of the Catholic tradition, I find my home here at St. Thomas More College, a Catholic liberal arts college, and welcoming all you tonight here. We extend that invitation as a welcome place for all people from all backgrounds. And I certainly am very proud to be a part of the team here. I wanted to thank Azeezah for her wonderful talk. I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but I had the pleasure of having drinks or dinner on the first night of when you arrived on Tuesday night when you got here. And you shared with me briefly that it's difficult for you to write unless you're fired up, unless you're angry about something or frustrated, and you and I share that in common. But I have to say, you so eloquently and powerfully channeled that righteous anger with your words tonight. And I think it's reassuring to know and see so many people in that same pursuit, in that same jihad, right, to make the world a more compassionate, peaceful, and just place. So as we're working towards decolonizing violence and the violence of the law, to build on your talk, right, we're shifting towards seeing each other as brothers and sisters, right, and prioritizing the health of our common home and peace and justice as we move forward. While there's a lot of work to be done, it really fills me with hope to know that there's so many of us that are engaged in the same collective action and channeling that towards the greater good. So moving forward here, we have a panel coming up. We're going to give you guys about 5 minutes just to stretch your legs and have a drink of water or use the washroom. And then I invite you guys to come back and engage in the panel where Dr. Fatrizal Halim will introduce some of our local faith leaders to engage in some dialogue with Azeezah Kanji and Dr. Afsuruddin. So in about 5 minutes, we'll meet back and we'll engage in our panel. Excellent. Thank you, guys.